The messenger came out of the heat haze at a dead run, his horse foaming white at the bit, and Edith Hawthorne knew, before she saw the blood, that something in the valley had broken beyond mending. She was at the well when she heard the hoofbeats, cranking the bucket up from water that had sunk 6 feet lower than it should have been in July, and she set the bucket down hard enough to slosh over her boots. The rider came through the gap in her fence where the gate had blown off its hinge 2 winters back and never been fixed, and he did not slow. He came straight for the porch, and only when his horse skidded on the hardpan did Edith see the dark stain spreading through his shirt below the collarbone, black against the blue cotton, and the gray color of his face beneath a complexion that should have been brown as saddle leather. "Henry," she said, and ran. Henry 2 Moons slid rather than dismounted, and she caught him under the arms before he struck the ground, staggering with his weight, feeling the wet heat of his blood soak through her sleeve. He was young, not yet 20, and she had known him since he was a boy running messages between his grandfather's allotment and her husband's ranch, back when Thomas was alive and the water still ran deep enough in the ditch that nobody argued over it. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he gasped, in English first, because he knew she would need it fast, and then in Shoshone, the words tumbling together as if his mind could not decide which language would save him faster. "The ledger, Croft's ledger. It is wrong. He wrote it wrong on purpose. I saw him. I saw Corbin burning the true one in the stove at the loan office, and he coughed, and his hand went to the oilcloth pouch slung across his chest, soaked through at one corner. I took the copy, the real one. It is here. You have to show the judge, you have to show someone before what, Henry?" "Before they come," he said, and his eyes, glassy with pain, went past her shoulder toward the road, toward the dust that even now was rising pale gold in the distance, 3 riders or 4 coming on hard. Edith did not waste time asking who they were. She had lived 7 years in this valley, married 5 of them to a rancher who had died of a fever 2 summers past, and widowed 2 more, and in that time she had learned that when men came riding hard toward a lone woman's house in a drought year, the reasons were never friendly. "Inside," she said, and half dragged, half walked him up the porch steps, and it was only once she had him laid on the kitchen floor, out of any line of sight from the road, that she peeled back his shirt and saw the wound was a graze along the ribs, ugly and bleeding freely, but not, she thought, mortal if it was tended quickly. She pressed a folded dish towel hard against it and set his own hand over it to hold the pressure, and she took the oilcloth pouch from around his neck and did not open it. There was no time. "Who is coming, Henry?" "Corbin, Croft." "Corbin," he managed, "and 2 others, I do not know their names. Croft sent them after I ran. He knows I saw." She thought fast, the way she had learned to think fast in the years since Thomas died, when there had been no one else to do her thinking for her. The root cellar. It was the only place in the house with a door that locked from the inside, dug into the hillside behind the kitchen, cool even in this terrible summer. And if she put him there with water and the pouch, and if she could keep 3 armed men on the porch long enough for the smell to lose their scent, she had gotten him halfway across the kitchen floor, his arms slung over her shoulders, when she heard the first rider come into the yard. "Mrs. Hawthorne." The voice was Wade Corbin's, and it had the particular pleasant menace of a man who enjoyed being feared. "We know you have got company. No need to make this ugly." She left Henry 2 Moons sitting propped against the cellar door frame, his hand pressed to his side, and she picked up the shotgun from beside the stove, the one Thomas had left her, an old double barrel that she kept loaded more from habit than expectation, and she walked out onto the porch. 3 riders sat their horses in her yard, dust settling slow around their boots in the windless heat. Corbin was in the middle, a broad man with a sunburned neck and small eyes, and on either side of him were men she did not recognize, hired only for this, she guessed, men with the particular blankness of those who did not intend to remember faces. "You are trespassing on my land," Edith said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I would thank you to turn around and ride back the way you came." "We are looking for a boy," Corbin said. "Half Shoshone riding a bay gelding might be hurt. You would not know anything about that, would you, ma'am? I have not seen anyone. Corbin smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. Funny, because there is blood on your porch step, fresh as paint. Edith did not look down. She kept her eyes on Corbin's face and the shotgun steady against her hip, and she said, I cut myself dressing a chicken this morning. It is a dry year, Mr. Corbin. Even the chickens are thirsty enough to fight. For a long moment nobody moved. Then one of the strange men, the one on Corbin's left, leaned over and spoke low, and Corbin's small eyes narrowed, and Edith understood that they had decided not to believe her, and that a woman with a shotgun on a porch was an obstacle they had already priced into their morning's work. What happened next happened fast, the way violence in that country always happened fast, without the decency of warning. One of the strange men swung down off his horse with a coil of rope in his hand, moving toward the side of the house where the hay barn stood half full of the summer's poor cutting, and Edith understood with a cold lurch that they meant to search the outbuildings, and that Henry Two Moons could not survive being found. She raised the shotgun and fired into the dirt in front of the man's boots, close enough to make him jump backward with a curse, and in the chaos of that single shot, in the rearing of startled horses and the shouting, she heard rather than saw the match struck, saw rather than heard the first orange lick of flame catch in the dry hay stacked against the barn wall. She would later understand that it had not been an accident. Corbin's second man, while the shotgun blast drew every eye, had crouched at the base of the barn with a lucifer match, and in a summer as dry as that one, in a barn packed with hay cured to the consistency of paper, it took only a single small flame to become something that could not be called back. You will burn for this, Edith said, and she meant it in every sense the words could carry, but Corbin was already wheeling his horse. Tell your Indian friend, he called back over the rising crackle of fire, that Mr. Croft does not like being spied on. And then the three of them were gone in a boil of dust, leaving her alone in a yard where the hay barn had become, in less than 2 minutes, a column of flame taller than the house. Edith ran for the well. She would say later, when she had time to think back on it, that those first minutes were the longest and most useless of her life, hauling bucket after bucket from a well already low with drought, throwing water that hissed to nothing against heat that curled the hair on her arms, while behind her in the house, Henry Two Moons called out weakly that he could help, that he was not so hurt he could not carry water, and she shouted back at him to stay down, to stay hidden. Because if the men came back and found him, it would not matter whether the barn stood or fell. The fire found the dry grass beside the barn within minutes, a hungry orange line spreading toward the corral, toward the tool shed, toward, if it was not stopped, the house itself. And Edith understood with the flat clarity of true fear that she could not do this alone, that she had perhaps 10 more minutes before the whole of what her husband had built, and what she had kept alive with her own hands for 2 years since his death, went up into the wide bleached Wyoming sky. It was at that moment, with smoke stinging her eyes and her arms shaking from the weight of the bucket, that she heard hooves on the road and looked up, and saw a stranger coming hard toward the flame. He came in low over his horse's neck, a big buckskin gelding lathered from a run that had clearly started before he ever saw the smoke, and he did not slow at the gate the way a cautious man would have. He came straight through the gap where the hinge had rusted loose, and he was off the horse before it had fully stopped, already shouting something to her that she could not hear over the roar of the fire. "Water! Where is your water?" He called again, closer now, and she saw him properly for the first time. A lean man, dust-colored through years of trail, wide-shouldered under a shirt gone gray with sweat and travel, a face weathered brown and lined at the eyes from squinting into 1,000 horizons, perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a little more. He wore a gun belt, but his hands were empty of anything but purpose. "The well," she gasped, pointing. "And the ditch past the corral, if we can cut it, show me." There was no time for names. He followed her to the well and took the bucket from her hands, and his grip on the rope was sure and hard, and within a minute he had rigged a second bucket from a coil of picket rope he carried on his saddle, so that they worked in a rhythm, one hauling while the other threw. And though it was still not enough, though the barn was clearly beyond saving, the line of grass fire toward the corral began slowly, agonizingly, to lose ground. "The ditch," he said again between hauls, his breath coming hard. "You said there is a ditch, past the corral. It has water still, low but water. Show me, quick." She led him at a run around the burning barn, close enough that the heat pressed against the side of her face like a hand, to where the old irrigation ditch her husband had dug ran along the property line, a trickle of muddy water at its bottom that in a wet year would have been knee-deep. The stranger did not hesitate. He drew the shovel that hung lashed to his saddle roll, the kind every trail hand carried for digging fire breaks and burying dead stock, and he began to cut a channel from the ditch toward the fire's leading edge, widening the low spot, letting the trickle spread thin and sluggish across the parched ground in the fire's path. "It will not stop it," Edith said, coughing on smoke. "There is not enough water." "It does not need to stop it," he said, driving the shovel again. "It needs to slow it long enough for us to beat down what is left with wet sacking. Get me anything made of cloth you do not mind ruining." She ran for the house, tore the oilcloth from her kitchen table, grabbed 2 horse blankets from the tack room, and when she returned, he had already soaked a length of canvas tarp in the ditch water and was beating at the flame's edge where it crept toward the dry grass near the corral fence. She joined him without being told, soaking blankets and slapping them down over burning grass, and for what felt like an hour but was likely 20 minutes, the two of them worked side by side in a heat that blistered the air, saying almost nothing, communicating instead through the shared rhythm of desperate labor, until at last the fire, starved of fresh fuel by the wet channel and beaten flat wherever it tried to jump the line, guttered down to smoke and embers, leaving the barn a smoking ruin but the house, the corral, and the tool shed standing. Edith sank down onto the ground where she stood, her arms trembling, her face streaked black with soot, and only then did she look properly at the man who had ridden out of nowhere to save what was left of her home. "I am obliged to you," she said when she had breath enough to speak. "More than obliged. I do not know your name." "Edgar Watkins." He crouched beside her, wiping his face with a forearm that came away black. "I was driving a small herd south along the old Sweetwater Road, bound for the railhead at Green River. Saw your smoke from 3 miles off and figured a woman alone did not set a fire that size on purpose. You left your herd, left it with my 2 hands. Told them to hold the beeves at the crossing and wait on me. A fire like that does not care whether I am in a hurry to make the railhead." He looked past her at the smoking ruin of the barn, at the blackened grass, and then more carefully at her. "You are hurt." "No, not me." She hesitated, and in that hesitation Edgar Watkins watched her face carefully, the way a man watches weather building on a horizon, and she made a decision that she would later understand had been the first thread of trust between them, though she could not have named it that in the moment. "There is a young man inside. Shot. He came to warn me of something, and the men who shot him are the same men who burned my barn." Edgar's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, hardened, the way a man's face settles when a task has become suddenly clear to him. "Then we had better see to him," he said, and stood, and offered her his hand to rise, and it was the first time she felt the calluses of his palm against hers, rough as rope, warm despite the horror of the last hour, and she found herself noticing, in the strange sideways way the mind notices small things during large disasters, that his eyes were a pale gray-green, like sage after rain, a color she had not seen in this drought-brown country in longer than she cared to remember. Henry Two Moons was still conscious when they came inside, pale and sweating but alert, and Edgar knelt beside him with the easy competence of a man who had dressed 100 wounds on the trail, tearing a clean shirt into strips, checking that the bleeding had slowed to a seep. "You are fortunate," Edgar said. "Ball went along the rib, did not go in. You will hurt like the devil for a month, but you will live to hurt. Who taught you to doctor? Edith asked, watching his hands work. 14 years on cattle trails, Edgar said without looking up. You learn to doctor or you learn to bury. I decided I preferred doctoring. He tied off the last strip of cloth and sat back on his heels. Now, somebody had better tell me why a boy got shot riding to warn you, and why 3 men thought burning your barn was a reasonable answer to it. Henry Two Moons and Edith exchanged a look, and it was Edith who answered, because she understood before Edgar did that the oilcloth pouch still lying on the kitchen floor where Henry had dropped it might be the only proof in the whole of Fremont County that Silas Croft was a thief. There is a ledger, she said, the real one. My husband, before he died, borrowed against this ranch from the Larkspur Cattle Loan and Trust, same as half the ranchers in this valley. The loan office is run by a man named Silas Croft. Henry works odd hours cleaning the loan office and the livery next door, and he says he saw Croft altering the book of accounts, marking payments as missed when they were not, so that he can call the loans in default and take the land, and the water rights that come with it, while there is not enough water in this whole territory to keep half of us alive as it is. Edgar was quiet for a moment, and something moved behind his pale eyes that Edith could not read, something that looked, though she could not be certain, like recognition or dread or both at once. Croft, he said at last carefully, as though testing the weight of the name in his mouth. I have heard that name before. Not here, somewhere else. You know him. I know men who do what he does, Edgar said, and did not elaborate, and Edith, watching his face close like a door, understood that there was more behind that answer than he was willing to give her, and filed the understanding away, the way she filed away every uncertain thing in that hard year for later use. That night, after Henry Two Moons had been settled into the small bedroom that had been Edith's husband's study, and after Edgar had ridden out at dusk to bring his herd and his 2 trail hands to bed down in the far pasture rather than leave them waiting at a dry crossing, Edith sat alone on her porch step and looked at the ruin of her barn smoking faintly against the last violet light, and allowed herself, for the first time since the riders had come, to be afraid. She was still there when Edgar returned on foot, having left his men to settle the herd, and he sat down on the step beside her without asking, close enough that she could smell smoke and horse and something warmer beneath it, and for a while neither of them spoke. You did not have to stay, she said finally. You have a herd to deliver, a schedule, I imagine, and money riding on making the railhead on time. I have 2 good hands who can hold cattle at a river crossing for a few days without me standing over them, Edgar said. And I have never in 14 years of driving cattle through this country ridden past a burning house and kept going, and I do not intend to start tonight. Why? He looked at her sideways, and in the near dark his face was unreadable, but his voice, when it came, was low and honest in a way that surprised her. Because a fire like that is not the kind of thing that finishes when the flames go out, Mrs. Hawthorne. Men who burn barns to send a message do not stop at one message. You are going to need more hands than your own before this is done, and mine are free for the asking, if you will have them. Edith studied him for a long moment in the dark. She had buried a husband who had made her promises he had not lived long enough to keep, and she had learned in the 2 hard years since that the safest thing a woman alone could do was trust nothing offered too easily. I do not know you, Mr. Watkins, she said. You rode in off the road and put out my fire, and I am grateful for it truly, more than I can say. But I have learned not to hand my trust to a man simply because he is useful in a crisis. If you stay, I will want the truth of you, all of it, not just the parts that are convenient. Edgar was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the valley, the mountains a black jagged line against a sky gone the color of a bruise. That is a fair thing to ask, he said finally. I will tell you this much tonight, and the rest when I have found the courage for it. I have not always done work I am proud of. There was a time, years back, when I rode for men not so different from your Mr. Croft, and I did not ask enough questions about what my wages were buying. I left that life. I do not intend to lie to you about it forever, but I would ask you to let me tell it in my own time, when I have earned enough of your trust that you will believe I have changed, and not simply that I am telling you what you want to hear." It was not a full confession, and Edith knew it, but there was something in the plainness of his admission, in the fact that he had offered it unasked rather than wait to be caught in a lie, that eased something tight in her chest. "All right," she said, "your own time. But do not make me wait so long that I stop believing there was ever a good reason for the waiting." He looked at her then, and something passed between them in the dark, quick and warm as a struck match, and Edith felt it land somewhere low in her stomach, an awareness of him, of the width of his shoulder inches from hers, of the low, easy sound of his voice, that she had not felt toward any man since before Thomas died, and that frightened her nearly as much as the fire had. "Fair enough," Edgar said softly. "Good night, Mrs. Hawthorne." "Edith," she said before she quite decided to say it, "if you are going to stay and dig fire breaks in my pasture, you may as well use my name." "Edith," he said, testing it, and something in the way he said it made her glad of the darkness that hid whatever her face was doing. The next morning Edith rode into the town of Larkspur with Henry Two Moons's oilcloth pouch sewn into the lining of her skirt, unwilling to leave it at the ranch, and equally unwilling to be caught carrying it openly. Larkspur was a modest cluster of clapboard buildings strung along a single dusty street beside the Popo-Ag River, which that summer ran so low and slow that boys waded across it without wetting their knees. She passed the church, the livery, the dry goods store run by a Swedish immigrant named Ezra Lindqvist, and came at last to the squat brick building with gold lettering on its window that read Larkspur Cattle Loan and Trust, S. Croft, proprietor. She did not go in. Not yet. Instead, she crossed to Lindqvist's store, where the shopkeeper greeted her with the careful warmth of a man who kept his opinions to himself in a small town, but was glad enough to share them with the right person in private. "Mrs. Hawthorne, you look like a woman who has had a hard night. My barn burned yesterday, Mr. Lindqvist." His face changed, the careful neutrality dropping away into real alarm. "Burned." "Lightning or," she said quietly, and watched understanding move across his features. "You are not the first," he said, lowering his voice though the store was empty. "The Petersons lost their haystacks in June, called it an accident. Old man Riordan's well went bad in May, salted, folks said, though nobody could prove it. And now the bank is calling in loans right and left, and every rancher who cannot pay finds his land bought up quiet by a company out of Cheyenne that nobody has ever met a face belonging to. Do you know who owns that company?" Lindqvist glanced toward the window, toward the street, toward the loan office 3 doors down. "I did the books for Mr. Croft 2 years back, before he decided he preferred to keep his own accounts. I saw enough columns of figures in that time to know how a ledger is supposed to look when it is honest, Mrs. Hawthorne. I have not seen his books since, but I have heard enough gossip from men leaving that office pale and shaking to make a guess. I need an ally, Mr. Lindqvist, not a guess, and I need to know whether there is a judge or a marshal in this territory who cannot be bought." "There is Judge Halloran out of Lander," Lindqvist said slowly. "Fair man, so far as I know, though he only rides circuit through here twice a year, and the next sitting is not for 6 weeks. As for a marshal, we have only Sheriff Purnell, and Purnell holds his own note with Croft's bank, same as half this valley." It was not encouraging news, but Edith had not expected encouragement. She had come for information, and information she had gotten. She thanked Lindqvist, bought a length of cloth she did not particularly need as cover for her visit, and was turning to leave when the bell above the door rang and Mrs. Constance Odell came in, a widow like herself who kept a small dairy operation 2 miles north, her face flushed from the heat and from evident agitation. "Edith Hawthorne, thank the Lord, I heard about your barn from the Kellerman boy and I have been half sick with worry. Are you well? Is the boy who was hurt? You have heard about Henry too. This is a small valley, my dear. Everyone has heard something, though most of it wrong. Constance Odell lowered her voice, glancing at Lindqvist, who busied himself with great tact behind his counter. "I will tell you plainly, Edith, because I have known you long enough to trust you with it. Croft's bank holds my note too, and last month his clerk told me I had missed a payment I know for a fact I made in cash with my own hands, and I have the receipt to prove it, except that when I brought the receipt to show him, he told me their copy of the ledger showed different, and that the matter was closed." Edith felt something settle into place, a pattern emerging from scattered pieces the way stars emerge from a darkening sky. "Do you still have that receipt?" "I have it sewn into my Bible, where I keep everything I do not trust a man to leave alone." "Keep it there a little longer," Edith said, "but be ready to bring it forward when I ask you. I believe I am going to need every honest ledger and receipt in this valley before this is finished, and I believe I know now why my barn burned." That afternoon, riding home with the sun a hammer on her shoulders and the dust of the road settling gray on her skirt, Edith found herself thinking not of Croft, nor of the danger gathering around her, but of Edgar Watkins, of the particular gentleness with which his rough hands had worked over Henry 2 Moons's wound, of the honesty in his voice on the porch step the night before, honesty that had stopped short of a full confession, but had not pretended to be more than it was. She did not know yet what shadow lay behind his admission that he had once ridden for men like Croft, but she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to know, not out of suspicion alone, but out of something closer to hope, the dangerous, unfamiliar hope that a good man might have come riding out of her past drought-stricken horizon at exactly the moment she needed one. She found him, when she returned, mending the corral fence where the fire had scorched 2 rails to charcoal, his shirt off in the brutal heat, his back a map of old scars she did not yet have the right to ask about, sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on his shoulders. He looked up when he heard her horse, and something in his face eased as if he had been waiting without quite admitting it to himself, to know that she had returned safely. "You look like a woman with news," he said. "I have news," she said, dismounting, "and I have a favor to ask, and I think both of them are going to be dangerous." Edgar set down his hammer and gave her his full attention, and she told him what Lindqvist and Mrs. Odell had told her, and watched him listen with the stillness of a man weighing every word for its true value rather than its comfort. "Then we need Henry's ledger read properly, and read soon," Edgar said, when she had finished. "And we need it read by someone Croft cannot buy or fright. Judge Halloran does not ride circuit for 6 weeks. Then we do not wait for the judge. We take it to your Shoshone friends first, since Henry works for his grandfather's people as much as he works for the town, and I would guess his grandfather has as much reason as any rancher in this valley to want Croft stopped. A man like Croft does not much care whose water he steals, so long as it is water he can sell." It was, Edith realized, exactly the kind of clear-eyed practical thinking she needed, and she found herself grateful for it in a way that went beyond simple relief. She was accustomed, in the 2 years since Thomas's death, to carrying every decision alone, and there was something disarming, almost dangerous to her guarded heart, in having a capable mind to think alongside instead of merely to lean on. The following morning, with Henry 2 Moons well enough to ride slow and short distances, Edith and Edgar accompanied him north along the river toward the allotment where his grandfather, a respected elder named Old Antelope, lived with an extended family that had chosen, a generation before, to take individual landholdings near the edge of the reservation boundary rather than remain solely within its lines, a choice that had bought them a precarious peace with their white neighbors. Contingent always on goodwill, that this drought summer had worn thin as old rope. Old Antelope received them beneath a cottonwood tree beside a spring that, though reduced, still ran clear, and Edith greeted him first in Shoshone, the words coming to her easily despite disuse, a language her own father, once a clerk for the Indian agent at Fort Washakie, had made certain she learned as a girl, believing rightly that a valley shared between two peoples would need translators long after the treaties were signed. Old Antelope's face, deeply lined, warmed at the sound of his own tongue spoken with care and respect, and he answered her in kind. And for several minutes the two of them spoke together while Edgar and Henry Two Moons waited, and Edith explained the ledger, the burned barn, the pattern of stolen water and manufactured debts that Croft had woven across the valley like a spider building toward a single terrible web. He says, Edith translated at last, turning to Edgar, that his people have watched the ditch levels for 3 summers and known that more water leaves this valley through Croft's paper claims than through any drought God has sent us. He says his grandson was right to ride to me, because I am the only voice in this valley both sides trust to carry the truth whole, without shaving pieces off it to please either side. That is a heavy trust to carry, Edgar said quietly. It is the only thing I have that is worth more than land, Edith said. My husband left me a ranch mortgaged to a man I now believe to be a thief. But nobody can take from me the fact that when I say a word, both the ranchers in Larkspur and the families on this river believe I have said it honestly. That is worth more to me right now than the deed to my own barn. Old Antelope spoke again, more slowly, and Edith listened with growing stillness, and when she turned back to Edgar there was steel in her voice that had not been there before. He says his people will stand with us when the time comes to prove Croft's fraud before the judge, and that they will lend hands to fight fire, dig ditch, and stand witness on one condition, which is that when this is finished and the water rights are settled honestly, the agreement that divides the ditch between the ranches and the allotments is put in writing, in both languages, with my name on it as translator, so that no future Croft can twist an oral understanding into a lie nobody can disprove. Edgar looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration plain on his weathered face. That seems to me a small price for an honest man to pay for a great deal of help. Croft is not an honest man, Edith said, which is precisely why we are going to need every ally this valley can offer before we are done. It was 3 days later, in the blistering hush of a Wyoming afternoon, so hot that even the meadowlarks had gone silent, that Edith learned the rest of what Edgar Watkins had been carrying since he rode into her burning yard. A drover passing through with a small remuda of horses for sale, an old acquaintance of Edgar's from trail days, stopped at the ranch for water and stayed for supper. And over beans and cornbread, he told stories the way trail men always told stories, with more relish than tact. And one of those stories concerned a range war in the Texas Panhandle 6 years past, when a cattle syndicate had hired gunmen to push smallholders off land the syndicate wanted for grazing, and one of those gunmen, the drover said with a laugh that had no idea how it landed, had been young Edgar Watkins himself, riding for wages he had not asked too many questions about, until the night a homesteader named Whitcomb was shot dead defending a fence line, and Edgar Watkins had ridden away from that outfit the next morning and never taken syndicate wages again. Edith did not speak of it that night, waiting instead until the drover had ridden on the next morning, and then she found Edgar at the corral, and she asked him plainly whether the story was true. Edgar did not deny it and did not soften it. It is true, he said. Every word of it, though there is more to it than a man tells over supper for a laugh. I rode for the Panhandle Land and Cattle Company for 2 years, doing the kind of work I told myself was only enforcement, only collecting on debts owed fair and square, until the night Josiah Whitcomb died on his own fence line with his own children watching from the door, and I understood that I had been telling myself lies to make ugly work feel clean. I left the next morning. I have not taken $1 since from any man whose business was pushing the weak off land they had a right to hold. I did not tell you the whole of it before because I was ashamed of it, Edith, and because I did not know yet whether you would look at me and see only what I once was, rather than what I have tried since to become. Edith stood very still, feeling the old caution rise in her, the hard-learned instinct to protect herself from a man's convenient confessions. And yet she found, examining her own heart with the same honesty she demanded of him, that what she felt was not betrayal but something more complicated, a recognition that the man before her had chosen, at real cost, to walk away from an easy wickedness, and had chosen again, now, to tell her the truth unprompted rather than wait to be exposed by a stranger's careless story. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "I know it. But you did tell me, before Croft or Corbin or anyone else could use it against you as a weapon, and you told me the whole of it, not a polished piece of it." She studied his face, the genuine misery in it, the absence of any attempt to excuse himself further. "I asked you for honesty, Edgar, not for a spotless past. I do not think there is a soul in this territory over the age of 20 who has not done something they would take back if they could. What I needed to know was whether you would tell me true things even when true things cost you something. You have shown me that you will. That is enough, for now, to go on trusting you." Something in Edgar's shoulders loosened, a tension she had not fully registered until it left him. "I do not deserve that so easily." "I did not say it was easy," Edith said, and found herself, without quite deciding to, closing the last small distance between them, so that when he reached for her hand it was the most natural thing in the world to let him take it, his rough, calloused fingers closing warm around hers in the hot, still air of the corral. "I said it was enough. There is a difference. Do not mistake my trust for something you no longer have to earn every day you stay." "I intend to earn it every day I have left," Edgar said, low, and for a moment neither of them moved, standing close in the heat with the horses shifting behind the rails and the whole burned, drought-struck valley stretching silent around them. And Edith understood with a clarity that both frightened and steadied her, that she had begun, against every careful instinct 2 years of widowhood had taught her, to fall in love with this trail-worn, honest, dangerous man who had ridden out of the smoke to save what was left of her home. He did not kiss her that afternoon. He only held her hand a moment longer than courtesy required, and then released it, and said, with a rough gentleness that undid her more than any bold gesture could have, "I would like to court you properly, Edith Hawthorne, if you will allow it, slow and plain, the way a woman who has been let down before deserves to be courted. I am not in a hurry to rush past the parts where we learn whether we suit." "I would like that," she said, and found that she meant it entirely. Trouble, however, does not wait for courtship to run its patient course, and within the week, the valley's slow-simmering crisis boiled over into open danger. It came first as rumor carried by a rider from the south end of the valley. Cattle missing from the Hendricks spread, driven off in the night, and hoofprints leading not toward any outlaw hideout but toward a box canyon that, by strange coincidence, lay on land the Hendricks family had recently defaulted on, according to Croft's ledgers, though old man Hendricks swore on his mother's grave that he had made every payment. Edgar rode out within the hour, taking Edgar's own 2 trail hands, Silas Muncie and a young cowboy named Deacon Farrow who had stayed on after the herd reached its buyer at Green River rather than draw wages for the ride home, drawn instead by loyalty to a trail boss who had never once left a hand behind. Edith wanted to ride with him and said so plainly, but Edgar, crouching to check his rifle before mounting, shook his head. "This part is mine to handle, Edith, not because you are not capable. God knows I have seen you fight fire and face down armed men on your own porch, but because rustled cattle in rough country is exactly the kind of work I have spent 14 years learning to do, and because if Corbin's men are desperate enough to steal stock outright, they may be desperate enough to shoot first and ask questions never. I need you here, working the part only you can work, gathering the proof, keeping Henry and his family safe, and keeping Mrs. Odell's receipt from disappearing into whatever fire Croft sets next. We are not so different in our courage. You and I, we are only different in our tools." It was not a demand but a genuine accounting of strengths, and Edith, examining it honestly, found she could not argue with it. "Come back to me," she said instead, and Edgar, already turning his horse, looked back at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, something between promise and prayer. "Always," he said, and rode. The confrontation in the box canyon that followed was brief and ugly, and but for a measure of luck and Edgar's 14 years of trail-hardened instinct, might have ended very differently. He and his two hands came upon Corbin's rustlers just past dawn, 3 men driving 20 head of Hendrick's stock deeper into the canyon toward a corral that had no business existing on unclaimed land. And rather than ride and shouting, Edgar had them circle wide and come down from the canyon rim, so that when the confrontation came, it came with the rustlers looking up rifle barrels rather than down them. There was a moment, brief and terrible, when one of the strange men went for his pistol rather than surrender, and Edgar's shot, fired without hesitation from a range that would have made a lesser man's hand shake, took the pistol clean out of the man's grip, along with the top joint of 2 fingers, a wound that ended the argument instantly and permanently without ending a life. The other 2 surrendered without further trouble, and it was from the mouth of the wounded man, moaning and cursing on the canyon floor while Deacon Farrow bound his ruined hand, that Edgar extracted the confirmation he needed. Corbin had ordered the rustling on Croft's direct instruction, to manufacture proof that the Hendrick stock had been sold off in secret to cover a supposed default, evidence Croft intended to present to any judge who came asking why the ranch had been seized. They brought the cattle home to Hendrick's, and they brought the 2 uninjured rustlers to Sheriff Purnell in Larkspur, and though Purnell's discomfort at the accusations against Croft was plain on his face, the presence of 2 confessed rustlers in his jail, along with a signed statement, however reluctantly given, naming Croft as the man who ordered the theft, was enough to make even a compromised sheriff understand that a reckoning was coming whether he wished to be part of it or not. Edgar returned to the ranch 2 days later, tired and dust-caked but whole, and Edith met him at the gate before he had even dismounted, her relief so plain on her face that she did not bother to disguise it, and when he swung down from the saddle she went into his arms without a word, and he held her, smelling of horse and gunpowder and long hard riding, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply standing together in the yard while his tired horse cropped at the sparse dry grass beside them. "You came back," she said finally, into his shoulder. "I told you I would." "I believed you," she said, and pulled back just enough to look at his face, "and that frightens me more than the fire did." "Why?" "Because believing a man keeps his word is the most dangerous thing a widow can do," Edith said. "It means I have started to build my life around the shape of you, Edgar Watkins, and I do not know yet where that leaves me if you should ever fail to come back." Edgar's hand came up to cradle the side of her face, his thumb brushing the dust and worry from her cheek with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the rifle still slung across his back. "I cannot promise you a life without danger, Edith. Not in this valley, not this year. But I can promise you that I will never give you cause to doubt my word on purpose, and that every time I ride away from you, I will be riding back toward you with everything in me." She kissed him then first before he could, rising on her toes in the dusty yard with the smell of horse sweat and gun oil still clinging to him, and he kissed her back with a restraint that spoke more of respect than hesitation, his arms coming around her careful and sure, and when at last they drew apart, both a little breathless, Edith found herself laughing softly, a rare unburdened sound in that hard summer. "What is funny?" Edgar asked, smiling despite himself. "Only that I spent 2 years telling myself I did not need any man's protection or company again," Edith said. "And here I am, standing in a burned dooryard, gladder to see you than I have been to see anything in a very long time." But even as their courtship deepened through the long hot weeks that followed, weeks of shared meals and slow evening talks on the porch step, of Edgar teaching her to read brand marks and Edith teaching him enough Shoshone to greet old Antelope's family properly, the valley around them grew more dangerous rather than less. Croft, cornered by the confessions of his own rustlers and by the growing alliance between Edith's ranch, the Odell Dairy, the Hendricks spread, and Old Antelope's family, did not retreat. He escalated. It began with dry lightning on a night in early September, a storm that brought no rain, only jagged white fire across the sky and a smell of ozone on air so parched it seemed to crackle. Edith woke near midnight to the smell of smoke, faint at first, then unmistakable, and when she and Edgar rode to the ridge above the ranch they saw it plainly. A line of flame moving across the dry grass of the upper valley, driven by a wind that had chosen, cruelly, that very night to rise out of the west, pushing the fire down toward every ranch and every allotment in its path. There was no time to wonder whether the fire had been set or born of the lightning. There was only time to act. Edgar sent Deacon Farrow riding hard for Larkspur to raise the alarm and gather every able hand with a shovel or a wet sack, while he and Edith rode for Old Antelope's allotment, knowing that the fire's path, sweeping down the valley on that western wind, would reach the river families before it reached the town. What followed was the hardest, most desperate work either of them had ever done, and it was work they did not do alone. By the time Edith and Edgar reached the Cottonwood Spring, Old Antelope's family was already moving, his grandsons and granddaughters driving what stock they had toward the river, elder women gathering what could be saved from the small cabins, and Henry Two Moons, still favoring his healing ribs, directing the digging of a fire break along the ridge above the spring, with a competence that made clear he had learned fire fighting from people who had survived it before. "We cut the break here," Henry called to Edgar, pointing along a natural break in the terrain where the grass thinned near an outcrop of red stone, "and we backfire from the river side, burn a strip toward the main fire so there is nothing left for it to feed on when it reaches us." It was exactly the tactic Edgar himself would have chosen, learned on cattle ranges where grass fires were an old familiar enemy, and the two men, one Shoshone and one a wandering Texan, worked together through the roaring dark with a wordless understanding that transcended everything the valley's old divisions had taught them to expect of each other. Edith, meanwhile, organized the water relay, setting Old Antelope's granddaughters and Mrs. Odell, who had arrived on a borrowed horse the moment she saw the glow in the sky, into a chain, passing buckets and wet blankets from the shrinking spring to wherever the firebreak crew needed them most, calling instructions in both English and Shoshone, so that no one, regardless of which language they had grown up speaking, was ever left uncertain of where they were needed. The fire came on faster than any of them had hoped, a wall of orange visible now even through the smoke, driven relentlessly by that terrible dry wind. And there was a moment, close to 2 in the morning, when it seemed the firebreak would not hold, when the flames leapt a 30-foot gap that should have stopped them and caught in a stand of sagebrush dangerously close to the cabins. It was Edith who saw it first, screaming a warning that carried clear over the roar, and it was Edgar who reached the spot fastest, beating at the new flame with a wetted horse blanket while Henry Two Moons and 2 of his cousins cut a hasty second break behind him, buying just enough time for the water relay to reach them with enough soaked sacking to smother the last of it. By the time the sky began to gray with false dawn, the fire had burned itself out against the river to the east and the cut breaks to the north and west, leaving a wide black scar across the upper valley, but sparing, through hours of coordinated, desperate labor by ranchers and Shoshone families working side by side for perhaps the first time in that valley's contested history, every home and every barn that had stood in its path. Riders from Larkspur, arriving late but in numbers, having gathered every man and boy the town could spare, found the fire already conquered, and stood in the smoking dawn light looking at the strange, unprecedented sight of white ranchers and Shoshone families standing shoulder to shoulder, soot-blackened and exhausted, sharing water from the same canteens. It was Old Antelope who spoke first, once the fire wardens had confirmed the last embers dead, addressing the gathered crowd of Larkspur men in halting English before switching, for the finer points, to Shoshone that Edith translated aloud without being asked, her voice carrying clear across the ash-scented morning air. "He says," Edith called out, "that tonight this valley was not divided by a fence or a ditch or the color of a man's skin, but joined by the only thing that has ever truly mattered in this country, work done honestly, side by side, to save what belongs to all of us. He says that any man who wishes to burn that unity apart again, whether with lightning or with a struck match and a lie in a ledger book, will find he is fighting not one rancher and not one family, but a whole valley that has finally learned what it looks like to stand together." There was a long silence after she finished speaking, broken only by the crackle of dying embers and the distant call of a hawk circling the smoke-hazed sky. And then, one by one, the men of Larkspur, exhausted and humbled, began to nod, and some to speak agreement aloud, and Edith understood that whatever else that terrible night had cost the valley, it had also, perhaps, finally begun to heal something that had been broken far longer than the drought. It was in the confused, ash-strewn hours after the fire, as the sun rose fully over a valley half black and half golden, that Sheriff Purnell arrived at last from Larkspur, not with the fire crew but separately, on a horse ridden hard, his face gray with a different kind of fear than smoke inhalation could explain. "Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Watkins." He dismounted stiffly, and Edith saw that his hands were not quite steady. "I have come to tell you something I should have told you weeks ago, and I am ashamed that it took a night like this one to shake it loose in me." "Say it, Sheriff," Edgar said, his voice not unkind but not gentle either. "Croft came to my office last night, before the fire started, agitated, talking wild about needing to be rid of witnesses before the circuit judge's sitting, and he asked me to look the other way if certain matters came to a head this week. I refused him, finally. God forgive me for taking so long to find the spine for it, and he left angry, saying he had other means of settling accounts that did not require my cooperation." Purnell swallowed hard. "I believe, given the hour that fire started, that Croft himself may have set it, or had it set, meaning to burn out the very families who could testify against him, using the drought and the lightning storm as cover so that no one would ever prove different." "Can you prove that?" Edith asked. "I can testify to what he said to me, which is more than nothing though less than everything," Purnell said. "But there is something else. When he stormed out of my office, he left behind in his hurry a satchel. I did not open it until this morning, when I realized what a fool I had been not to. It is full of papers, Mrs. Hawthorne, ledger pages. The real ones, near as I can tell, matching entries against the false book he keeps at the loan office, showing every altered payment, every manufactured default, going back 3 years. Edith felt her breath catch. "Where is it now?" "In my office safe. I came to fetch you and Mr. Watkins to witness me opening it properly, in front of others, so that no one can later claim I planted or altered anything myself." Purnell's face, for the first time since Edith had known him, showed something like genuine resolve. "I have been a coward in this valley for too long, ma'am. I do not intend to keep being one." They rode for Larkspur within the hour, Edith carrying Henry Two Moons's original oilcloth-wrapped ledger pages alongside Mrs. Odell's carefully preserved receipt, Edgar riding close at her side with his rifle within easy reach, both of them aware that Croft, cornered now on every front, might yet attempt one final, desperate act before the truth could be laid before witnesses too numerous to silence. That final act came at the edge of town, where the road narrowed between two low bluffs before opening onto Larkspur's main street. Corbin was waiting there with 2 of his remaining men, having clearly guessed, or been told, the route Edith and Edgar would travel, and he stepped his horse out into the road with a rifle already leveled, his earlier pleasant menace gone entirely, replaced by the flat desperation of a man who understood his employer's schemes were unraveling beyond any hope of repair. "That satchel does not leave your hands, Sheriff," Corbin called out. "Nor those pages you are carrying, Mrs. Hawthorne." Hand them over, all of it, and you can ride on home unhurt. You shot an unarmed boy and burned my barn, Wade Corbin, Edith said, her voice steady though her heart hammered. I do not believe for one moment that unhurt is a promise you intend to keep. It was Edgar who moved first, not toward his own weapon but his horse, angling it deliberately between Edith and Corbin's leveled rifle with a calm that belied the danger, his own hand resting easy but ready near his gun belt. Corbin, you have got two men behind you who by now have watched their own rustling scheme collapse in a jail cell in town, and a boss who has been setting fires that near killed half this valley's children just to save his own thieving hide. I would think hard before you add murdering a sheriff and a widow to the charges already stacking against you, because that is the difference between hanging for fraud and hanging for a killing nobody in this territory will ever forgive. For a long, taut moment nobody moved, the only sound the shift of horses' hooves and the distant call of a meadowlark oblivious to the danger below. Then one of Corbin's men, the younger of the two, lowered his rifle slowly and said, in a voice gone suddenly uncertain, "Wade, I did not sign on for hanging. Rustling was one thing, this is another." It was enough. Corbin's resolve, built on bluff rather than true conviction, cracked visibly at his own man's defection, and in the space of that crack, Sheriff Purnell, who had been quietly working his own weapon free while attention focused elsewhere, brought his rifle to bear with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "Drop it, Wade," Purnell said. "I have spent a month being a coward in this valley. I do not intend to die being one. And I certainly do not intend to let you kill two good people in front of witnesses on the road into my own town." Corbin's rifle lowered slowly, and within minutes he and his remaining men had been disarmed and bound, and the small strange procession, Purnell's satchel, Edith's ledger pages, Mrs. Odell's receipt, and now 3 more prisoners besides, rode into Larkspur together to a town already buzzing with news of the night's fire and gathering, in the dusty street outside the sheriff's office, to witness whatever reckoning was finally, after a summer of drought and fear and manufactured ruin, about to arrive. Silas Croft was found not fleeing, as some expected, but sitting rigid behind his own desk in the lone office, as though hoping that stillness alone might convince the gathering crowd outside his window that nothing at all was wrong. He did not resist arrest, though his protests, once Purnell laid the true ledger pages beside the false ones on the office counter for the crowd to see, grew increasingly shrill and increasingly unconvincing, particularly once Ezra Lindqvist stepped forward to confirm, from his own memory of the accounts he had once kept, that the handwriting on the true pages matched entries he himself had made years before, entries that bore no resemblance to the altered figures Croft had since substituted. Judge Halloran, sent for by a fast rider the moment the fraud became undeniable, arrived from Lander within 4 days rather than waiting the full 6 weeks of his usual circuit, moved by the seriousness of arson and fraud charges layered atop one another, and the hearing he convened in the Larkspur Church, the only building large enough to hold the crowd of witnesses, ran a single long, exhausting day. Henry Two Moons testified, still favoring his healing ribs, to what he had seen through the lone office window. Mrs. Odell produced her Bible-hidden receipt. Old Antelope, with Edith translating every word with painstaking, unimpeachable accuracy, testified to 3 summers of watched water levels that no drought alone could explain. Edgar testified to the confession wrung from Corbin's wounded rustler in the Box Canyon. And Sheriff Purnell, his earlier cowardice laid as bare as his current resolve, testified to Croft's own agitated words the night before the fire. Croft was convicted of fraud and conspiracy to arson, sentenced to the territorial prison at Laramie for a term of years that satisfied even the angriest of his victims, and the loans he had manufactured false defaults against were, by the judge's order, restored to their honest standing, the seized land returned or the fraudulent foreclosures voided outright. Wade Corbin, convicted alongside him, received a sentence of his own, and the valley, battered and fire-scarred but no longer preyed upon, began, in the slow way of all recovering things, to breathe again. It was 3 weeks after the hearing, on an evening when the first cool breath of autumn had finally begun to temper the drought's brutal grip, that Edgar Watkins asked Edith Hawthorne to marry him, not with grand ceremony, but sitting on the same porch step where they had first spoken honestly to each other months before, the rebuilt barn a dark solid shape against the evening sky behind them, raised in the weeks since the trial with the help of nearly every family in the valley, Shoshone and settler alike, working side by side in a way that had, by unspoken agreement, become simply how things were done now in that corner of Wyoming territory. "I have thought on how to say this properly for near a week," Edgar admitted, turning his hat in his hands in a rare display of nerves that Edith found, after everything they had survived together, unexpectedly endearing. "I have ridden difficult trails most of my adult life, Edith, driven cattle through weather and country that would break lesser men, and I have never once in all that time found a place I wanted to stop riding toward. Then I rode into your burning yard, and I have not wanted to leave since, not because you needed rescuing, though the Lord knows you did not need much rescuing at all, but because you are the first person who ever asked me to be honest instead of merely useful, and being honest with you has made me a better man than 14 years on the trail ever did. I would like to stop riding past your gate and start riding through it every day, if you will have me as your husband." Edith, who had faced down armed men on her own porch and stood her ground against a valley's worth of manufactured fear, found herself, for once, entirely without steady words, and answered him instead by taking his weathered face in both her hands and kissing him with a certainty that needed no further speech to explain itself. And when at last she drew back, she said simply, "Yes, Edgar Watkins. I will have you, and gladly, and I will hold you to every honest word you have ever spoken to me, for the rest of both our lives." They were married in October, in the small Larkspur church, with a ceremony that drew, in defiance of every old boundary the valley had once observed, both the ranching families of the town and Old Antelope's extended family from the river allotments, Henry Two Moons standing near the front, fully healed now, grinning wide enough to show the gap where a baby tooth had never properly been replaced by an adult one, and Mrs. Odell weeping openly into a handkerchief she had embroidered specially for the occasion. Edith wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist, and Edgar wore a borrowed coat that fit him poorly across the shoulders and did not matter to either of them in the slightest. And when the preacher pronounced them married, the cheer that went up from the gathered crowd carried clear across the river to where the ranches stood, healing, in the golden autumn light. They did not build a grand life in the way the old stories sometimes promised, with sprawling herds and distant fortunes. They built instead something sturdier and, to Edith's mind, far more valuable. The Hawthorne Ranch, rebuilt with a barn strong enough to outlast another generation of drought, became jointly theirs in name and in truth, the deed redrawn to carry both their names, Edith Hawthorne Watkins and Edgar Watkins together, a partnership recognized by the same Judge Halloran who had once presided over Croft's downfall. Edgar took on the work of the herds and the fences, and the difficult calving seasons with the same trail-honed competence that had once made him the man every outfit trusted with its hardest drives, while Edith formalized, at Old Antelope's insistence, and with the valley's grateful cooperation, a written agreement dividing the shared ditch water fairly between ranch and allotment, an agreement carried in both English and Shoshone, with her own careful signature as translator anchoring both versions against any future Croft who might come seeking to twist an unwritten understanding into a lie. In the years that followed that hard drought summer, the Hawthorne Watkins Ranch became known throughout the valley not merely for its cattle, which prospered once the rains finally returned the following spring, but for something rarer: a standing understanding, honored by settlers and Shoshone families alike, that any dispute over water or land or old grievance could be brought first to Edith's kitchen table, where her fluency in both languages and her hard-won reputation for unflinching honesty had made her, in the truest sense, the Valley's translator not merely of words, but of trust itself. Edgar, for his part, never rode a difficult cattle drive again without first making certain his wife knew exactly when to expect him home, and he never once, in all the years that followed, gave her reason to doubt that when he said he would return, he meant it entirely. On the evening of their first anniversary, sitting once more on that same porch step where he had first asked to court her slowly and honestly, Edgar looked out over pastures gone green again with autumn rain, over a rebuilt barn and a valley healed of its worst wounds, and said, "I used to think the trail was the only place I belonged, Edith. Too restless to stay, too ashamed of my own past to let anyone close enough to ask me to. And now," Edith asked, leaning into his shoulder, the weight of the day settling comfortably between them the way it had come to settle every evening since their wedding. "Now I know the trail was only ever leading me here," Edgar said, "to the one place and the one person worth finally stopping for." And Edith, who had once believed a burning barn marked the worst night of her life, understood instead, with her husband's arm warm around her and the whole healed valley stretching quiet and golden before them, that it had marked instead the first night of everything good that followed, and she would not, given the choice again, have changed a single hard hour of how they had found their way to each other.